Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great webinar on tap, as always, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. We also have 3 polling questions during the course of the webinar, so hopefully we can get everybody involved in those. And finally, at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Kubernetes, what to monitor and when. Our speakers today are Joe Pelletier, who is the VP of Products at Fairwinds, Yvonne Fetch, who is the Site Reliability Engineer at Fairwinds, and Robert Brennan, who's the Director of Open Source at Fairwinds. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you all for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Excellent. Well, Joe, I know you're going to be kicking us off. I'm going to put myself on mute and let you get right to it.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Pelletier. I head up the product side here at Fairwinds. Before we begin today, I just wanted to give a quick overview of who is Fairwinds. So Fairwinds, we offer a Kubernetes enablement platform that consists of services, open source, and software so that you can build, secure, and run reliable and scalable Kubernetes infrastructure. From our services perspective, we do run expertly managed cloud-native infrastructure. But we also contribute an enormous amount of open source back to the community. You can recognize us from a number of different projects like Polaris and Goldilocks, and you can see us on GitHub at our open source repo. And finally, we also build software for policy-driven configuration validation. Now, today, we're going to be here to talk about monitoring and what you need to monitor in Kubernetes. And so as part of today's discussion, we want to make it as interactive as we go. So please ask questions as we go along. Don't hesitate to drop a question, and we'll get back to you with an answer or discussion around that particular topic. From an agenda perspective, we have a few different things we'd like to cover. One of the things that we want to kind of highlight is just, the general monitoring challenges that exist in Kubernetes. Specifically helping you understand what to monitor and some recommendations around tools, as well as some ideas and recommendations on next steps. So tips that you can take and bring back to your team around monitoring workloads in Kubernetes. And then finally, we'll leave some time at the end for a little bit of Q&A. Before we get into it, we want to just kind of recap a little bit about the high-level infrastructure strategies that companies pursue. And we all know that more and more of the infrastructure stack is being consumed with cloud services, presenting engineering teams with a variety of strategies for running their apps. Their options are to run applications on premise, or you could use infrastructure as a service or cloud solutions, or you can even leverage platform as a service solutions so that you're focusing more on your applications and data. And when it comes to this modern infrastructure, everything is configuration as code driven. So even if you're in the cloud where you don't have to worry about monitoring the underlying physical infrastructure of storage, computer networking, you still need to concern yourself with what's happening inside Kubernetes and how that system is behaving. And that's what we're going to focus on a little bit today. Now, when you're running Kubernetes, you're likely running it somewhere between on-premise or in the cloud, and you might even be using a managed Kubernetes service like GKE or EKS to help you, manage the underlying control plane and nodes for your infrastructure. But even if you're leveraging those services, monitoring is still really critical because you need a way to monitor what's happening inside Kubernetes as pods scale, or whether or not your nodes or kubelets are healthy. And we'll go into very specific examples of that today. So, kind of the bottom line we want you to take away with is there's a monitoring scenario for every infrastructure strategy, and we're hoping to help you understand what that looks like for Kubernetes. A great kind of primer here might be taking a step back and looking at the types of monitoring that exist in the marketplace today. Whether you're running in the cloud or on premise, we break down the different types of considerations across the stack. So if we look at the lowest tier here where it says infrastructure monitoring, these are things like logs or the network or the containers and Kubernetes configurations that you need to consider, consider as part of your monitoring strategy. We're also introducing a second concept here called tier 2 monitoring, which is really around have you configured your kube configurations correctly? And it's a little bit more of a proactive approach, which we'll address later in today's presentation. The third layer of monitoring is around app monitoring. And this is really helps you understand whether or not there's bottlenecks in your code. And there's a variety of tools in the marketplace, such as app performance monitoring tools, which can help you with this layer of monitoring itself. And finally, there's user monitoring. This really helps you focus on what your users see, so you can ensure that you're delivering the desired experience and desired performance. And there's different types of tools as part of this monitoring, like session replay and synthetic monitoring, that are important for you to consider when you build an overall monitoring strategy. But again, for today's presentation, we're going to keep ourselves focused more on that infrastructure monitoring and tier 2 monitoring section and help you understand what's needed for Kubernetes. So when it comes to monitoring challenges, I think we might have a poll question for this slide. So I'll turn it over to the DevOps.com team to share out that poll.
Excellent. Well, I am sending out the polling question right now. What is your current monitoring challenge? The selections are tuning alert thresholds and keeping alerts actionable, adding new monitors to avoid repeating an incident, keeping monitors the same across multiple environments, or containing my excitement about monitoring all the things. All right, you've got some really great selections there to choose from. So go ahead and make your selection. And while we are waiting for folks to do that, I do want to remind the audience that we are taking questions at any time during today's webinar. So you don't have to wait for the question and answer period. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please go ahead and just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit it at any time. All right, we are coming up on 1 minute for this polling question. So I'm going to go ahead and close it out in 3, 2, 1, and then we'll take a look at the results. Looks like the majority of folks said their current monitoring challenge is keeping monitors the same across multiple environments. Sounds like a problem that is pretty widespread. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a popular problem. Actually, I would love to get Ivan and Robert's thoughts on that too, get your experience with Kubernetes.
Yeah, it's super important to keep your monitors the same across environments for, I think, pretty straightforward reasons. Wanting to be able to tune those monitors and tune your alerts, and also running multiple Kubernetes clusters, multiple environments, not have splay across that. For us, we use infrastructure as code to accomplish that. So there's a number of standard infrastructure as code tools, whether you're using Terraform. We also happen to have something we're going to talk about a bit later in the presentation that lends itself to this as well. That's a product that Fairwinds has created that's open source, but absolutely without sameness across your monitors, it makes management a lot more of a nightmare.
Yeah, I'll just echo the infrastructure as code part. I think that's a huge piece of being able to keep monitors and really everything the same across multiple environments. And if you spin up a new environment, being able to replay everything you did in your past environments in the new environment is super important.
All right, well, I will go ahead and hide these results and let you guys get back into your presentation, Joe.
Excellent. It's really great to just kind of recap what folks see as their common monitoring challenges. At this point, I'm going to actually turn it over to Robert, who's our Director of Open Source at Fairwinds, to help kind of walk through some of the high-level monitoring challenges that we also see, and then specifically go into what to monitor with Kubernetes. Robert, after you.
Thanks, Joe. So one of the biggest, sort of the big overarching challenge with monitoring a Kubernetes is just figuring out what to monitor and what not to monitor. The big thing is we need to ensure that every actual problem triggers an alert. I.e., we don't want any false negatives. We don't want to miss anything that's actually a problem. But it's also important to make sure that pagers aren't too noisy. We don't want too many false positives. Ideally, if we have to tune that ratio, we would prefer a false positive to a false negative. But if our pagers are too noisy, our SREs are going to be exhausted. You're going to get a little bit of boy who cried wolf effect, where they might not take pages as seriously as they need to if 90% of them are false alarms. The big thing, though, is we want to catch issues before they become user-facing, right? We want to catch things as the problem starts to crop up in the cluster, but before it actually takes down a workload, causes an outage, or causes a degradation in performance. And without the right monitoring, your operations can be interrupted. Teams might not be able to deploy. You may experience an outage. SLAs might be breached. There are a number of different, revenue impacting problems that can result from poor monitoring. So in terms
hey, Joe,
of,
this is Charlene real quick. I apologize. I don't mean to interrupt, but for some reason, it looks like your screen is frozen on the polling question. I'm wondering if maybe you can do a quick refresh and see if we can get the slides back up.
Oh, yeah. Let me go ahead and try to figure that out. Can you see the screen now? What to monitor in Kubernetes?
See, yes. Thank you so much.
Excellent. I think we might actually have a polling question on this slide as well.
All right, then.
Yeah, we have a polling question around what are you monitoring today? And I think that's going to be a great foundation before we get into some specifics around what to monitor.
All right, well, that polling question should be on your screen now. The question is, what are you monitoring today? The answers or selections are everything, as much as time and money allows. User experience and application availability, or the things our CEO think are most important. So once again, go ahead and make it your selection. We'll give you guys a couple more seconds and then we'll go ahead and close it out. But before we do, just another quick reminder that today's event is being recorded. So if you have to step away and come back, you'll have the ability to watch the webinar in its entirety again. We will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand following today's webinar. So fret not if you miss any part of it, because you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Okay, with that, I'll go ahead and close out the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, sharing the results now. Looks like user experience and application availability, easy for me to say, is the big winner here for what folks are monitoring today. I imagine that's pretty much in line with what you guys are seeing out there.
yeah, I think that's a, that is really, the first thing you want to tackle with monitoring is, what might end up affecting my users. Not surprised to see that everything is the second most popular answer here. I think that's it's a very typical tactic that companies take, is to just try and monitor everything. The one caution I would give is that there is such a thing as too much monitoring. You can create noise by putting monitors on too many different things, setting up alerts for too many different things. You might think you're being overly cautious, but at the end of the day, you may end up causing fatigue for whoever's carrying the pagers around.
Makes sense. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hide these results, and hopefully these slides will pop back up and you should be good. Okay. Joe, we're not seeing your screen again. Can you do a refresh?
Yeah, let me just do a refresh. Whoops.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
All right, I think you can see it now, right? Perfect.
Can see it, yep, thanks.
Excellent. So I think at this point, we're going to jump right into what to monitor for Kubernetes, and I'll pass it over to you, Robert, again.
Yeah, so we've started just by giving a high level of monitoring strategies overall. We wanted to go a little bit deeper into specific things within Kubernetes that would be helpful to monitor. So 6 things we're going to go through here are monitoring the number of replicas on deployments, pod crashes, issues with horizontal pod autoscaling, problems with kubelets, problems with Nginx configuration reloading, and pods that are not in a running state. So one big thing to watch for is deployments that don't have any replicas. When a deployment has 0 replicas, that means it's fully scaled down, it's unable to serve any traffic. Now this can potentially be due to something that's intentional. You might be say swapping out a database or something like that. This might be intended downtime, so it might not actually be an issue. But more likely than not, this could be due to a misconfiguration. It could be due to pods crashing, not being able to pull the container image. So it's definitely something you want to have eyes on. You'd also want to watch for pod crashes. Pods will crash when a container process exits, or for short-lived containers like jobs or cron jobs if the process exits non-zero. This is usually a sign that something's wrong. The thing is that Kubernetes can recover in these scenarios a lot of the time. It will just, if one pod crashes, it will spin up a new one. So rather than just looking for any pod crashes as something that should trigger a page, we typically look for an increase in pod crashes above some baseline threshold. The next thing to watch out for are issues with horizontal pod autoscaling. Autoscaling is one of the most used pieces of functionality in Kubernetes. We typically rely on this feature to make sure that if we get a large increase in traffic, our deployments remain highly available. But if there's a lack of resources in the cluster, or your Docker image registry is down, or there's a misconfiguration issue, it can prevent your workloads from scaling up. The HBA won't be able to hit its target number of replicas, and this should always trigger an alert. Another big thing to monitor is an unhealthy kubelet. So each node that's running workloads in your cluster will have a kubelet running in order to speak to the Kubernetes masters. Any issues with the connection between the kubelet and the masters can cause all sorts of misconfiguration issues. Eventually, if a kubelet is down, workloads will be evicted from that node. This could be caused by all sorts of different things. Definitely something that you want to be monitoring, though. Another problem we've seen in the wild crop up is issues with Nginx configuration reloading. If you have an error in one of your Kubernetes ingress resources or a misconfiguration in Nginx, that can prevent Nginx from reloading its configuration and prevent traffic from being routed to the correct workload. So this is definitely something you want to keep your eye on. And then finally, one very major thing that you'll want to keep an eye on is pods that are not in running state. So Kubernetes frequently starts and stops pods, so not all pods will be running all the time. But if you have many pods that are stuck in a pending or stopped state, that's generally an indication that something's wrong. The cluster might be out of resources. There might be something going on, with Kubernetes internals. So if the number of pods that are pending or stopped exceeds some baseline threshold, exceeds an amount that you're used to seeing, that's definitely something you'll want to alert on. So that should be a good overview of what exactly to monitor in Kubernetes. I think, do we have another poll here?
Yes, we do. Yeah, I think that was a helpful overview, Robert. Our next poll question here is actually on what monitoring tools folks might be using today to monitor Kubernetes.
Yeah, so that should be on your screen now. What is your primary monitoring tool? You can select from one of the following: Datadog, New Relic, Sumo, or similar service, Prometheus, Thanos, or other Prometheus-based solution, or we don't have one. Go ahead and make your selection. And I believe this is the final poll for this webinar, so hopefully we can get as many people involved with this one as possible. And one more time, I'm just letting you guys know that if you do have a question, you do not have to wait for the question and answer period. You can go ahead and submit your question using the GoToWebinar control panel at any time. And then we will hopefully try to get to as many questions as we can near the end of today's webinar. All right, we're going to go ahead and close this polling question out in a 3, 2, 1. And here are the results. It looks like the majority are using, looks like an open source crowd out here, Prometheus, Thanos, or other Prometheus-based solution. So is that what you guys are seeing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends on the context. I'd actually love to get Ivan or Robert's view on the pros and cons, though, of different of like a Datadog New Relic versus an open source alternative like Prometheus.
Yeah, sure. So, we happen to use Datadog pretty strongly. We're monitoring lots of clusters across lots of customers, and it's been something that has helped us to standardize on. But some of the pros and cons are running your own solution in cluster or in a separate management cluster, perhaps to monitor all the things, is different in that you have to take into account the data storage aspect. So while you do have to pay for that for a hosted SaaS solution such as Datadog, you have to pay for it either way, and it's just more to manage is the simple way to put it. So you also can get more flexibility, but however, even things that typically provide Prometheus metrics that you could scrape with Prometheus, you can also scrape with other solutions. So we'll do that with Datadog as well. Scrape Prometheus metrics from things such as certificate expiration and network throughput type alerts that we want to get. So the trade-off primarily, Joe, there is that if you're going to monitor it yourself, you're going to get flexibility that you might not get with a SaaS solution, or it might not look exactly the way you want it to. But you also need to manage that storage of logs, retention of data. If you have a problem in your cluster and you're also running monitoring in that same cluster, you could have a bit of a chicken and egg situation going where your monitoring is actually broken as well, and you're not getting the telemetry you need.
That's great advice, Ivan. Thank you for that.
All right, I'll hide the results, let you get back to it.
Thank you. All right, and I think you can see my screen again, correct? Oh, here we are. Perfect.
Yeah, there you go.
So that's actually a great summary from Ivan around the types of monitoring tools for Kubernetes. I'll turn it back over to Robert to give us a quick run through of these tools, and then we'll jump into a tier 2 monitoring conversation in just a moment.
Yes, so the way we typically break down monitoring solutions are, like you saw in the polling question, on-prem and open source, so solutions typically that involve Prometheus for Kubernetes, versus more SaaS-oriented solutions like Datadog, New Relic, Sumo Logic, Splunk, things like that. So I would say, the broad difference would be that the open source solutions, they're going to be free, which is definitely nice. But as Ivan pointed out, there's a lot of storage involved. There's a lot of headaches involved in self-hosting. So a SaaS can be nice, even though it certainly comes with a price tag. It is nice to have all these things just kind of taken care of for you. And large platforms like Datadog do have a pretty healthy community around them. There are deep integrations between Datadog and Kubernetes, as well as other SaaS providers.
Awesome. And Robert, you also mentioned that I think earlier in the presentation that Fairwinds has made some innovation in terms of the open source community around monitoring. Can you share a little bit more around what Astro does to help with maintaining and managing dynamic monitors?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Astro is a project that we built to help us service our customers who are all Datadog users. Basically what Astro does is it creates dynamic monitors in response to Kubernetes events. So if a new deployment is created, you can have a monitor that's patterned out for all new deployments. And when Astro sees that new deployment get created, it will call the Datadog API to create a monitor specifically for that deployment.
That's awesome. All right, let's jump into a new topic here around tier 2 monitoring. Tier 2 monitoring is something we mentioned earlier in the presentation as sort of an area that helps organizations stay on top of preventing problems from entering their cluster. And so, as an organization who's, leveraging monitoring best practices, there becomes a point where you also want to kind of, instead of just reacting to issues, be able to prevent and add more proactiveness to your monitoring strategy. And there's a few types of issues that can be prevented before they turn into reliability challenges or production incidents. And that's really what we mean by tier 2 monitoring. We really are trying to help you keep your Kubernetes configurations well managed and provide you with the tools and guidance so that you can stay ahead of these challenges before they become bigger reliability issues later on. And so I'll give you an example of one, right? One of them is just around, are your deployments configured properly? There's a number of different settings for Kubernetes deployments that need to be looked at before you end up deploying those configurations into a cluster. And those are things like liveness probes or readiness probes, and making sure that they're set so that Kubernetes knows when to send traffic to those pods and be able to ensure that those containers are ready to receive that traffic. And on a similar level, there's also the CPU and memory limits in request, making sure that those are set. When you don't have these set properly, or if they're not set at all, Kubernetes can sometimes either accidentally starve resources or overconsume compute, which means that you might end up spending more money or using more capacity than you need. And these are examples of things that if you configure them properly ahead of time, it can help avoid having some of these infrastructure monitors fire and ultimately create an incident that you need to respond to. A couple other examples might include image tags and making sure that explicit image tags are being used. And oftentimes there's a challenge where Kubernetes may try to pull the latest image tag, and that could be an image that's either not ready for production or contains bugs, and then ultimately you're impacting and having a negative user experience. So, at the end of the day, tier 2 monitoring is about being kind of proactive, ensuring that your configurations are following best practices, and ultimately should show a reduction in the number of pages that you see from a monitoring perspective. I'll dig a little bit more into what it means to have resources set appropriately. We actually created a project here at Fairwinds called the Goldilocks Project. It's an open source tool that allows you to check the resource usage of a particular workload in your cluster, so that you can understand what should the CPU and memory requests and limits be. And so that tells Kubernetes how much CPU and memory should you actually allocate to that workload, and up into a certain point. So making sure that these are set appropriately both help avoid resource starvation, but also overspending and over allocating compute. Security is also a key part of a tier 2 monitoring approach. As we all know, there could be, security may not lead to a specific availability issue right away. But if an attacker takes advantage of a known vulnerability, or if an attacker uses a misconfigured workload to get access to the cluster or additional resources on that cluster, that can ultimately lead to a challenge that you would only find out after the fact via a monitor going off. And with tier 2 monitoring, it's not only about preventing reliability challenges or efficiency issues, it's also about preventing these security issues. So fortunately, there's actually quite a few different open source options out in the marketplace. These are some of the different tools out there that we recommend that help you stay ahead of CVEs in your containers, or help you validate your deployment configurations. A couple of these tools are Fairwinds tools like Polaris and Nova. Polaris will actually audit your Kubernetes configurations for a dozen or so different types of best practice issues. And Fairwinds Nova will also help you stay on top of using the latest Helm charts so that you're staying up to date and you're using the latest software, keeping your cluster healthy and available. So with that said, we're going to move on and help you understand some of the recommendations and next steps, and so how to take this information and apply it. I would say the first thing that you want to do is really just kind of figure out, how do you ensure that you've got the right stakeholders and the right folks on board with your monitoring strategy. So it's really important to understand who's responsible for both infrastructure and workloads in your organization. You want to make sure the right people are being alerted at the right time, and you want to limit that noise to the end operators, right? We know that a lot of alert fatigue can cause folks to ignore monitoring, and so striking that balance between false positives and false negatives is really key. You also want to make sure you're selecting the right tools. We talked about the variety of open source alternatives as well as commercial alternatives, which each carry their own pro and con, but picking the one that's right for you so that you can then build those dashboards and elevate the importance of monitoring for Kubernetes in your organization. And finally, the impact and urgency of monitors also need to be configured so that you know which monitors are critical to be following and responding to, which was the other ones are being more informational. A couple other suggestions, and we really kind of frame these as questions for you to ask and answer internally, is to evaluate your goals, right? And there's a couple of good ones here that I think are key in terms of ensuring that you have the right monitors in place. The first one is, are you implementing those monitors that help you catch issues before they ultimately affect your users, right? You want to make sure that when you're detecting a change that it's at the point where it's not yet causing a detrimental impact to your end users and gives you the opportunity to respond and fix the underlying issue. A lot of our message around tier 2 monitoring is in the same vein, where tier 2 monitoring is about preventing and being proactive around how you've set your configurations so that you can prevent these incidents from occurring later on. The other one is really measuring, as you do get pages, what percentage of them turn out to be false positives, so you can drive that feedback loop into the operations team and really tune those pages to be more striking a better balance between false positive and false negative, and making sure that you've got actionable monitors that your ops team will wake up and respond to. And then I would say one of the final things to think about is, how do you communicate up to the executive team that you're making progress on your monitoring strategy, you're covering the right bases, you're not creating extra or work where people are responding to false monitors, but you're actually helping reduce the number of incidents over time. And so these are just some considerations to ask and answer yourself internally as you go forward with your monitoring strategy. So with that said, monitoring is an essential aspect for maintaining a healthy Kubernetes cluster. Monitoring, even when in the context of Kubernetes on the cloud, you're still having to monitor, and it's still an important part of running great Kubernetes operations. There are some great standards and tools out there to help facilitate a better process. We talked about some of them earlier. And as you evolve your monitors, continue to iterate on the feedback that you're getting from your ops team around how effective the monitors are. Are they actually helping you stay ahead of user-facing problems? And don't hesitate to seek out help when you need it. There's a number of great Kubernetes communities out there, including the Kubernetes Slack and Fairwinds community, to help you get access to experts when you need them. And so with that, I think we'll transition it over to questions.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we've gotten some questions in, but there is time. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel, and let's go ahead and dive in on questions that we have here. Our first question, let's see, so many of them. Okay, here we go. Secure hardening seems to be one of the biggest security areas for Kubernetes and Docker management. So yeah, I guess that was a comment. So along with that, image tags or signed images was the question.
Yeah, I can address a bit on both of those, even though I think that the first one might not have been exactly a question, but because it is a pretty important topic. So
Mm-hmm.
in terms of security, hardening, so on and so forth, being one of the most important areas, it definitely is, because Kubernetes is a much more distributed system and way of orchestrating containers. It can often feel like the security boundaries have been splayed from a previous world where it felt like we could limit particular applications and their security boundaries to specific physical servers or racks of servers and that kind of thing. So we definitely see this as an area that ties in with monitoring. It definitely fits into the things that Joe spoke really well to just a bit ago, the level of tier 2 monitoring things. And to be clear, tier 2 doesn't at all reflect any kind of importance or lack thereof, but we often refer to it as tier 2 in terms of a lot of those things that get monitored, not necessarily the case for security, but a lot of the things that get monitored and the stuff that Joe listed in the tier 2 segment are not all things that are going to necessarily go to pager. They're things that you want to be aware of for sure, but you don't necessarily want to wake up in the middle of the night because someone doesn't have a resource request or limit set on a pod, but you do care about that. So in terms of security and hardening as it applies to monitoring specifically, we also have some software that I don't want to talk about too much, but it can help provide a kind of bubbling up of what we call action items and in that respect, and that's called Fairwinds Insights. The question about image tags versus signed images, I think that was asked at the time that Joe was talking about the latest image tag and that potentially causing problems and so on. So I'm not completely sure if I'm tracking exactly what you might be getting at there, Frank. If you want to re-ask something a little bit more specific, I'd be happy to talk about that. So for signed images, I mean, you can use image pull secrets to help you secure images that you're pulling into your Kubernetes cluster, certainly, but I don't know if that's necessarily what you're getting at. There was one more question that I kind of responded to in the Q&A because it was apropos of Joe talking about tier 2, and that was, what about monitoring pod behavior or inter-pod communications? So if it's okay, I'm going to kind of just flow right into that one real quick.
Sure.
And Joe did touch on a lot of that with his tier 2 section as well, specifically things that you might monitor in Kubernetes pods. As far as inter-pod communications, that might be something that you would get some visibility into if you have a service mesh in the cluster. That's certainly not the only way to do it, but you can get some visibility about how your workloads, how your components of your applications communicate using some service mesh features, just as an example. Also, potentially, if you've got a CNI in your cluster that provides you network policies, you've got to be a little bit careful with how you monitor this, but because you can overwhelm your cluster and your events data store. But if you are tracking dropped packets at an appropriate level, then that's something that you could of course bubble into your monitoring and logging frameworks too. And get alerts, you got to be cautious about fatiguing yourself with those alerts. You don't want to denial of service yourself with alerts by triggering some dropped packets that somebody can, be directly responsible for how many times your pager goes off. It's a good point.
All right. Great. Next question. What recommendations can you provide for instrumenting apps that run in the Kubernetes clusters?
Yeah, so I mean, well, this was really mainly a presentation about instrumenting Kubernetes itself. Instrumenting the applications on top of that is also very important. Unfortunately, it does require a lot of application-specific context to really give strong recommendations there as to what should be monitored. Making sure that any error logs, trigger an alert, say, or an increase in 500 errors, things like that. But without knowing more about the specific application, it's hard to give specific advice. I would say it is helpful to use the same monitoring platform for both Kubernetes itself and any of the underlying applications. For instance, we use Datadog for both of those, and it allows us to correlate, say something that might be going wrong inside the cluster with an issue with our application.
All right, great. Let's see. Got lots of great questions here, but there's time. If you have a question, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and get it on in, and we'll try to get to it. Next question, is it important to monitor anonymous/untagged resources?
I'm not entirely sure what anonymous might mean here. I'll talk a little bit to untagged resources. So I might be revamping your question a little bit, Dennis. If I butcher it too much and answer a different question, then please feel free to speak up and we'll recover it if we can. As far as untagged resources and monitoring goes, if you are deploying things in cloud and you rely on tagging as part of your billing, assessment, monitoring, and so on and so forth, you would definitely want to monitor things that are untagged in terms of the first line of falling out of compliance. So that's a little bit of a hand-wavy answer there. I would also say you want to monitor anything that is relating to your application or could potentially impact your application regardless of whether it's tagged. And again, I apologize, I'm not sure how you mean by anonymous, but feel free to jump back in the Q&A box if you want to cover that more.
All right. Excellent. Okay, next question. What are the suggested logging framework or tools that are suited for Kubernetes monitoring?
I can speak to this a little bit. So there's a few things that, first of all, the answer to this is somewhat, unfortunately, it depends. But aside from you all doing the work to assess what's going to be the best fit for your own organization, I can still talk to some things that you want to explore having in your cluster. And some of them are complementary or are building blocks to you having good monitoring and logging frameworks. So the first one of those is having metric server in your Kubernetes cluster. This is not a direct monitoring tool, but it's going to facilitate you having metrics for things like your nodes and your pods in your cluster. So without metric server installed, this does come with all the typical managed Kubernetes like Google Kubernetes Engine or AWS CKS, Azure AKS, etc. But you want to make sure you've got metric server in your cluster. It's also required for you doing horizontal pod auto scaling, so using HPAs to scale your workloads without metrics and without resource requests and limits as well. There is no scaling your app. There's also something called kube state metrics, which builds on metric server. That's going to monitor things that have already been covered during the presentation, but kube state metrics is part of what makes this possible. It's going to monitor things like the replica availability that I believe it was Robert that mentioned, and pardon in his section, how many of the desired replicas do we have available for a particular app? Is something scaled down to 0? Do we care about that? It also is going to help you monitor kube state metrics is the terminations of pods. So if you've got pod crashes that happen, kube state metrics is the building block that can help you get that information. And then otherwise, we're starting to get into the realm of, do you want to use a service like Datadog to take our example, which can handle logging as well? You can ingest logs from your Kubernetes pods, or do you want to run something like Prometheus or Thanos or similar? Or there's somebody else mentioned in another Q&A, there's of course tons of choices. We're not being inclusive of everybody. We're just mentioning some ones that happen to be common to us. So you want to also pull logs if you're running your own Kubernetes nodes and masters through something like kops, for example, or you're using kubeadm to spin up your own clusters. You also want to make sure that you pull logs off of your masters and your nodes using something like FluentD, or there's a lot of other, Datadog does this as well. So hopefully that helps.
All right. Next question. This is a good one. What are the monitoring strategies you recommend for the configuration changes or misconfigurations from a security aspect?
Yeah, I can start with that one. And I'll pass it over to Ivan and Robert to add some more color. But I think that's a little bit around what we were talking about around tier 2 monitoring, which is really making sure that you have a configuration validation strategy in place. So one strategy is making sure that you kind of cover 3 different bases from a security perspective. One, making sure that you have a way to analyze your container images for known vulnerabilities. The second would be really around understanding your Kubernetes configurations, since everything is code these days. Making sure that the configuration code that tells Kubernetes how to run the container, that's also being inspected from a security standpoint. And then I would say the third one is understanding your overall kind of cluster security, which can include things like RBAC and whether or not you're using the latest patched versions of Kube, et cetera. And some of the strategies that we've seen folks pursue is there's definitely some great open source out there to look at, but also being able to kind of run some of these tools in the cluster to understand, what is your current state from a runtime perspective, but more ideally shifting it left into the development process so that you're testing these containers, you're testing the Kubernetes configuration as part of the development process, and validating it, at the point of pre-deployment using things like admission controllers to make sure that you're aligning with certain security policies. That's a high level, some high level ideas. I mean, I'll turn it over to Ivan and Robert for any ideas too, though.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that there are a lot of great auditing tools for Kubernetes that are open source out there in the wild. So if you want to just kind of get started on like trying to figure out what to monitor, using open source projects like Trivy for CVE scanning or Polaris for Kubernetes misconfiguration scanning are both great. They can both be pretty easily incorporated into CI/CD, and then a platform like Fairwinds Insights would let you basically aggregate all those open source tools into a single platform, so you could be checking it in CI/CD as well as inside your live cluster.
Excellent. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next question. Where would you put monitoring in the SDLC software development lifecycle?
It's an interesting question. I think the right answer would be everywhere in the software development lifecycle. So at each step in the process, you should be thinking about what should I be monitoring? Are these the right things to be monitoring? At the point that you actually go to implement it, there is going to be maintenance on the monitors themselves. It's really something that should be continuously, there should be a feedback loop of, you implement the monitors, see how they do, see are they too noisy, are they not noisy enough, and iterate there. It's not really something that you can just check a box and say, I'm doing monitoring now. You really have to be constantly thinking about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And like your monitors might end up alerting you on something that results in a configuration change that means you have to go back to the repo, make that change, and then push it through the process again. So I think it definitely is there's a feedback loop involved there. Ivan, I think you were about to say something. Sorry, apologies for cutting you off.
Oh yeah, no worries. I was just going to echo that. We mentioned this earlier, but part of making this all work in the SDLC sense is having infrastructure as code monitoring is important. Something we covered during the very beginning as a bullet point, but being able to have your monitoring live somewhere in the midst of your application code. So this is primarily focused. This presentation we've been giving is primarily focused on infrastructure monitoring, but of course, application monitoring has a lot of other facets to it that you're going to have. Some of those monitors live with your application code. Probably, for example, if you're telling Datadog to monitor services that relate to your application, you can reflect that as annotations on Kubernetes service objects to help have them be combined with the way your application is deployed. So there's some way of coupling that that's nice. The other thing I'll say about this is I think that it also makes the assessment of who is going to be responding to what kind of monitor is important. So related to what Joe just said, depending on how much your dev and your ops are DevOps and where the responsibility falls on pager, having application monitoring include application developers, in my personal opinion, is helpful to making sure that those monitors are actionable.
All right, great. We are about 10 minutes to the top of the hour. We have time for a few more questions. So last call, if you have a question for our panelists, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit it. Here's a good question for you. What do you think about Kubernetes deployments through cloud providers and their current monitoring offerings? Are they quote unquote enough, or would you add an extra layer on top of them, either vendor or open source based?
Kubernetes deployments through cloud providers and their current monitoring offerings. So, Federico, I'm assuming that this relates mostly to the offerings, cloud provider offerings specifically for monitoring. So again, if as I've said in other cases, if I kind of answer the wrong question, please feel free to restate something in the Q&A so we can help you as much as possible. I think that this is a bit of an it depends answer. Cloud providers certainly do give you log ingestion and some degree of monitoring to help you understand what's going on from a metrics turn into some kind of alerts. I would say, however, that I think everyone's going to probably get more bang for their buck, more value out of adding to what the cloud provider offers. So I would say that certainly use what the cloud provider gives you. There's value in what they're doing, but as you continue to evolve in your Kubernetes journey, you probably will find that you would like to have more options than might be most easily met through what the cloud provider is giving you, and you're going to want to augment that, or maybe you're going to want to shift from having them ingest your logs to ingesting your logs some other place that you're more familiar with.
All right, great. Okay, next question. How do you define the business process for managing the tools and monitoring strategy?
Yeah, Robert, you were going to say something?
I'm not super sure how to interpret this one. I mean, it's really something that has to live. Several different teams have to be talking about this, right? So you need your ops team to be thinking about what they want to be monitoring from an infrastructure perspective. Your dev team needs to be thinking about what they monitor from an application perspective. So it's typically going to be the kind of decision that bubbles all the way up to a head of engineering or a CTO. It really has to be a conversation between many different teams now. And I don't think I've seen a monitoring discussion go the same way at two different businesses ever, other than it being, lots of different stakeholders all trying to come to a conclusion together.
I would say look at business drivers that answer some pretty straightforward questions, which will still take some time and some deliberating, but essentially pose the question at all those layers that Robert just mentioned, which is, what things do we need to care about on the highest level possible that keep us in business? So strongly using these business drivers, things like overall user experience. Is our application up? You're still going to want to monitor all the infrastructure stuff. You're still going to want to have those proverbial smoke alarms helping you get wind of things that are coming that you want to address before they become full-blown fires. But ask those questions on the business level, and then let everything kind of trickle down through all the different parts of your organization, and find some alerts that are actionable.
Yeah, that's great advice from Ivan and Robert. And I would also say, like, if you're looking for a way to start having that conversation internally, we've also created this paper here that you can download at fairwinds.com on what needs monitoring and why. Covers a lot of the same recommendations from this presentation, but gives you an opportunity to Ivan's point, to focus on what really matters most to the business and to the end user.
There's a follow-up question I see on this point. Understood, but do you define the strategy in a document, or do you make notes after having a meeting? I would say you need to have conversations in your organization. You certainly can create some some starter bullet points and notes, some guidelines, but I think the most value comes out of having regular conversations and iterating on those conversations. It's going to take multiple conversations to make sure that what is happening in monitoring is aligned with the business, in my opinion. And anybody else has anything to add, feel free.
All right, well, they say silence is golden, so I guess that is going to be the end of that, because we are at about 5 minutes to the top of the hour, so unfortunately that is all the time that we have for the question and answer period. I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. We had some really great ones, so thank you very much. If we didn't get to your question, I think we got to all of them, maybe without maybe -1 or 2, but if we didn't get to your question, please know that the folks at Fairwinds are going to be getting a copy of all of the questions, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline to get your question answered. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any or all of the event, or if you just want to watch the presentation again, you will have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we are going to be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Okay, I mentioned at the top of the hour that we would be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and do that. Today's first winner is Eric M. Congratulations, Eric. Our second winner today is Frank D. Congratulations, Frank. Our third winner today is Lita M. Congratulations, Lita. And our final winner today is Michael S. Congratulations, Michael. We'll be following up with all 4 of you via email to get your $25 Amazon gift card over to you. So check your inbox. If you don't see something in your inbox, please check your spam folder. Okay, Joe, Ivan, Robert, thank you so much for a great presentation. As always, you guys do such a great job. So appreciate your time, your effort, your expertise, your energy, and all that good stuff. Thanks so much.
Thank you for the help, and thank everybody for attending and for the great questions. We really appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Yes, I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.